I'm Professor Barbara Keyes. In the next few minutes, I offer a brief taste of a second-year module that I teach on Nixon, Kissinger, and U.S. foreign policy. One of the central transformations we study is the restoration of relations between the U.S. and China that began in 1971 when President Richard Nixon announced that he had accepted an invitation to visit Beijing and to meet with China's leader Mao Zedong. The announcement was a bombshell because the U.S. and the People's Republic of China had not had formal relations since the Chinese Revolution in 1949. In fact, they hadn't had any relations. And they were intensely hostile toward each other. The official Chinese line was that the U.S. was an imperialist warmonger and the greatest threat to peace. To many Americans, Red China had long represented a singular villainous threat. All of that changed almost overnight. There was hardly an area of U.S. foreign relations that remained untouched by the Sino-American rapprochement. It enabled a new and more accommodating relationship with America's main Cold War adversary, the Soviet Union. And it laid a long-term foundation that would assist China's rise to world power. Few leaders have presided over such dramatic world historical shifts. The opening of relations between these two countries constituted one of the most significant transformations in international relations in the 20th century. It's one of the reasons why Nixon and his foreign policy advisor, Henry Kissinger, were then and have been since acclaimed by many as strategic visionaries and even geniuses. But Nixon and Kissinger from the beginning have also been the subject of intense controversy and criticism. In foreign policy, largely because of the Vietnam War, which they brought to an end only after more than 4 additional years of fighting, and which of course ultimately ended in humiliating defeat. But also because of undemocratic or illegal interventions in Cambodia, Chile, Argentina, Timor-Leste, Bangladesh, and elsewhere, where they abetted repression or even mass murder. Since Nixon's death in 1994, critics' ire has focused on Kissinger, who still today, in his late 90s, routinely draws protesters who want him tried as a war criminal. The basis of the Nixon-Kissinger foreign policy was widely considered to be realpolitik. This is a word of mid-19th century German coinage, often used as a synonym for power politics, meaning a foreign policy devoid of moral and ideological considerations. We complicate this overly simplistic view of realism to uncover how Nixon and Kissinger conceived of morality, as well as just how much ideology and emotion was threaded through what these men thought and did. The module looks closely at some of the major foreign policy events of the Nixon presidency. Détente, the relaxation of tension in the Cold War. SALT II, the first nuclear arms limitation treaty of the Cold War. Negotiating an end to the Vietnam War. The secret bombing and subsequent invasion of neutral Cambodia. Sponsoring an attempted coup in Chile shortly after the election of socialist President Salvador Allende. Shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East following the October War. Economic policy, like the dismantling of the Bretton Woods system and the end of the gold standard. The response to the 1973 oil embargo. Events in Angola, Rhodesia, the influence of human rights ideas in foreign policy, the effects of the Watergate scandal, and much else. And of course, especially the opening to China, centering on Nixon's visit to China in 1972, called the week that changed the world. We look at these fascinating events by studying some of a veritable mountain of historical works, but we also evaluate these historical works in part by taking a close look ourselves at some of the voluminous primary sources. Nixon's presidency is one of the most thoroughly documented in U.S. history, with millions of pages of declassified documents, ranging from Nixon's handwritten yellow pads to memoranda transcribing official talks with foreign leaders, along with other important sources, like, of course, the famous White House tapes.
It's going to work out one way or the other. If 2 doesn't go, that isn't too bad either.
No, it isn't.
We go ahead and make our deal.
Sure.
And we sink 2, and everybody says, thank God he was a tough son of a bitch on both sides. The hell with him.
That's right. Well, we accomplished our objectives. We gave the people in South Vietnam an opportunity, and if 2 wants to hang himself, that's his business.
We'll consider how to analyze these different sources, their reliability, their limitations, how they can be read by historians' version of triangulation, reading multiple sources against each other. Our aim is to assess the Nixon-Kissinger foreign policy record. One of their aims in the opening to China and détente with the Soviet Union was to help end the Vietnam War. Both China and the USSR supported North Vietnam, while the US supported South Vietnam. In linking détente to the war in Vietnam, the Nixon administration hoped to get the Chinese and the Soviets to put pressure on their North Vietnamese allies to negotiate a peace treaty. But this put Nixon and Kissinger in the paradoxical position of improving relations with America's 2 biggest communist adversaries, China and the Soviet Union, partly in order to get out of a war that was being fought precisely in order to contain those same adversaries. The other questions we examine include, was the opening to China less a stunning innovation initiated by Nixon and more, in fact, a natural result of broader developments in the international system that might have happened no matter who was president? Did Nixon and Kissinger needlessly prolong the end of the war in Vietnam? Or perhaps better, why did they needlessly prolong the end of the war? What were the costs and benefits of their secret back-channel style of diplomacy? And how much did it undermine democratic oversight of and support for U.S. policy? What can we learn about effective and ineffective leadership? And what do we make of the strange, almost love-hate relationship between the 2 men? And the effects of their egotism, jealousy, and ambition? How did these affect policy making? And how did their intense likes and dislikes of foreign leaders affect what one historian has called the line between policy and petulance? We dig deep into the specifics of Nixon and Kissinger's policies, but in digging deep, we aim to think big, to answer lasting questions about what constitutes success in foreign policy, where the balance lies in the interplay between the role of individuals and the larger historical circumstances in which they work, the proper role of morality and human rights in international affairs, the role of myth-making and the role of the media, and the human need for heroes in assessing the lasting hold of Kissinger in particular in the American mind. How one discerns and acts upon the national interest, and what the ultimate aims of power can and should be. One thing I think I can guarantee is that our excursion through one of the most fascinating periods of U.S. history, our excursion through power politics, secrets, lies, wars, bombings, invasions, coup d'etat, arduous negotiations, threats, insults, flattery, and so much more, will never be dull.